December 1945, Camp Hedges, Texas. Amiko Matsuda stood between two groups of women holding a bar of white soap in her trembling hand. The soap was stamped with small flowers and smelled faintly of lavender. It smelled like spring, like forgiveness, like everything she had been taught to refuse. On one side of the dormitory, Lieutenant Kazuko Ishikawa stood with her faction, 20 women rigid and silent, their faces carved from stone. On the other side, 27 women waited, uncertain, afraid, but no longer willing to die for a code that had already failed them. Sergeant Morrison stood in the doorway, not threatening, just present, a reminder that American law protected them now, that the old rules no longer applied. Kazuko's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "We must refuse. This is surrender. This is shame." Emiko looked at the soap in her hand. Such a small thing, such an impossible weight. She thought about how she had arrived here, about the lies, about the truth, about the journey that had brought her to this moment when kindness became the cruelest weapon of all. "How did we get here?" she whispered. And then, knowing the answer would take hours to tell, she closed her eyes and remembered. 3 months earlier, September 1945, the cargo hold of the transport ship smelled like rust and fear and the sourness of bodies too long confined. 47 Japanese women prisoners sat or lay on thin pallets spread across the metal floor. Some whispered prayers, others stared at nothing. All of them waited for whatever came next. Emiko sat with her back against the cold hull, her diary pressed against her chest like a shield. She had been writing since they left Okinawa. Writing helped. It made the fear feel smaller, more manageable, something she could contain within words on paper. She was 23 years old, a school teacher from Tokyo. Before the war, she had taught literature to young girls who dreamed of ordinary futures. She had loved poetry, especially the old forms. Haiku about cherry blossoms, tanka about autumn leaves, words that captured beauty in small, perfect moments. The war had taken all of that, had taken her classroom and her students and her books, had drafted her into the auxiliary corps for clerical work, had sent her to Okinawa to type reports and file documents and pretend that what she was doing mattered. Now she sailed toward the enemy's homeland, neither knowing if she would ever see Japan again. Beside her, Hana Fujimoto sat with her eyes closed. Hana had been Amiko's friend since school. They had studied together, laughed together, volunteered for the auxiliary corps together. Hana was 24, a nurse who had worked in field hospitals, who had seen things that left shadows in her eyes. "If they try to make us serve them," Emiko whispered, "we must die first." Hana's eyes opened. Her face was hollow with exhaustion. Yes, die first, but neither of them truly believed they would have the courage. The cyanide capsule was one thing, a quick decision in the heat of battle, but to choose death slowly, deliberately, in cold blood, that required a different kind of strength, the kind Emiko was not sure she possessed. The propaganda had been clear. Americans were monsters, their women cruel, their soldiers animals in human skin. They would violate, torture, humiliate. Death was mercy compared to what awaited in American captivity. Each wave that rocked the ship sounded like a drumbeat of fate. Each creak of metal a reminder that they sailed toward the unknown, toward the enemy, toward everything they had been taught to fear. Someone began singing softly, an old lullaby from Kyoto, a song about cherry blossoms and spring rain and home. An officer silenced her with a harsh word, but the silence that followed was heavier than the song had been. Emiko wrote in her diary by the dim light that filtered through gaps in the hull, "The ocean is vast, so is my fear. Tomorrow we reach America. Tomorrow we learn what monsters look like. I hope I have the courage to face them. I hope death comes quickly if it must come." She did not know yet that death would not come, that something far more dangerous awaited, that monsters would turn out to be men, that the greatest terror would be kindness. The ship smelled of salt and diesel and unwashed bodies. At night, the women huddled together for warmth. Some cried quietly. Others prayed to gods they half believed in. A few, like Emiko, wrote letters they would never send, words addressed to mothers and brothers and friends who might already be dead. Akane, the nurse, who was 28, told stories to the younger women to keep their minds occupied. Stories about her village before the war, about festivals and harvests and ordinary days when the worst thing that could happen was rain during planting season. But even her stories could not hold back the fear. It seeped through the hull like water, cold and relentless and impossible to escape. On the 14th day, someone shouted from above, "Land, America." The women crowded to the small portholes, pressing their faces against the glass. Emiko found a gap and looked out. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. Green fields stretched to the horizon. White houses with intact roofs dotted the landscape like scattered pearls. Trees stood tall and whole, bearing no scars of bombing. In the distance, a city rose against the blue sky, its buildings standing proud and untouched. Not a single column of smoke, not a crater, not a ruin. It was not burning. The propaganda had told them America was being destroyed by the war, that their cities were in flames, that their people were starving. That victory was inevitable because the enemy was collapsing under the weight of Japanese superiority. But here was a coastline that looked like a postcard, like peace, like a lie exposed. Hana pressed beside her, her breath fogging the glass. "It's not burning. They told us it was burning." The first crack appeared in the wall of belief they had built around themselves, small but unmistakable. If America looked like this, untouched and prosperous, what did that say about everything else they had been told? Emiko pulled out her diary, wrote with shaking hands, "The lie begins to crumble before we even step on land. If they lied about this, what else was false? What truth awaits us? I am more afraid now than before, because now I do not know what to believe." Around her, other women stood in shocked silence. Even those who had been most confident in Japanese victory found themselves unable to speak. The evidence before their eyes contradicted everything. And evidence, unlike propaganda, could not be argued away. The ship docked at a port. They were transferred to trains, guarded but not roughly. The American soldiers looked tired, young. Some smiled uncertainly, as if unsure how to treat enemy women who looked so small and frightened. None of them looked like monsters. The train pulled away from the coast, heading inland. Through the windows, America unfolded like a dream or a nightmare, depending on how you looked at it. Farms stretched to horizons so distant they seemed to curve with the earth. Cattle grazed in fields larger than entire Japanese villages. Towns appeared with shops full of goods and houses with painted shutters and people going about their lives as if war had never touched them. Cars drove on smooth roads. Children played in yards. Women hung laundry that gleamed white in the sun. Everything was clean, abundant, prosperous, untouched by the destruction that had consumed Japan. "How can they have so much?" Hana whispered. No one answered because the answer was too terrible, because it meant Japan had been fighting an enemy so far beyond their capacity that the war had been lost before it began. Because it meant every death, every sacrifice, every bombing raid had been for nothing. Lieutenant Kazuko moved through the train car, speaking quietly to the women who would listen. "Do not be deceived by what you see. This is their propaganda. They want you to think they are winning. But Japan is strong. Our spirit cannot be defeated by material things." She was 31 years old, an officer's widow whose husband had died at Guadalcanal. Her brother had been a kamikaze pilot. She wore her grief like armor and her ideology like a shield. Nothing could penetrate either, but even Kazuko's voice held less certainty than before. Even she could not deny the evidence outside the windows. The abundance, the peace, the sheer untouched prosperity of it all. The train rolled through Texas for hours. The landscape was enormous, sky stretching forever, land flat and endless. Nothing like the cramped islands of Japan where every inch of soil was precious. Before you continue this remarkable story, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from today. Your support helps us share these forgotten stories from the greatest generation. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Late afternoon, the train slowed. Steam billowed across a small station platform like a ghost, unsure where to rest. Beyond it, sunlight golden and clean, almost indecently bright after weeks in dim cargo holds and darker thoughts. The air here smelled faintly of wheat and soap, a strange, gentle smell, like something forgiven. "All right, ladies, we're here." The guard's voice was low, courteous, almost apologetic. Not shouting, not commanding, just informing. The door opened with a gentle hiss. The women looked at one another, hollow-eyed and sharp, skeletal shadows in faded khaki uniforms. Their hands clutched the few things they still owned: a comb, a photograph, a scrap of cloth embroidered with home, each object a talisman against forgetting. They stepped onto the platform one by one. The Texas heat pressed down, but not unpleasantly. The breeze moved softly, carrying the scent of bread baking somewhere nearby. The smell made Emiko's stomach clench with hunger and something else: longing, grief, the memory of a world before war. American soldiers stood nearby, rifles slung lazily over shoulders, not pointed, not threatening, just present. Their faces were young, farm boys and factory workers in uniform. Some smiled awkwardly, unsure how to treat enemy women who looked so fragile. Camp hedges stretched before them, low white barracks arranged in neat rows, clean gravel paths. A wooden sign that announced their destination in painted letters. Laundry lines where sheets swayed like surrendered flags. A water tower. A flagpole with the American flag snapping in the breeze. It was not the cage they had expected. It looked almost peaceful, almost safe. And that was somehow more terrifying than barbed wire and guard towers would have been. They were led through the gates, past a guard post where an American soldier nodded politely, down a gravel path that crunched under their feet, to a dormitory at the eastern edge of the compound. The building smelled like fresh paint and wood. Inside, rows of iron beds waited. Each bed had a mattress, not a thin pallet on concrete, an actual mattress, thick and stuffed, smelling faintly of detergent and sun. Beside each bed sat a folded towel and a small bar of soap. Emiko approached her assigned bed slowly, as if it might disappear if she moved too fast. The bed frame was simple iron. The mattress was covered with a white sheet tucked in at the corners with military precision. A thin blanket lay folded at the foot. A pillow, flat but soft, sat at the head. She picked up the soap. It was white, smooth, stamped with small flowers that had been pressed into the surface before it dried. It was heavier than she had imagined, more solid, more real. She pressed it to her nose. The scent was clean and faint and sweet. Lavender, or something like it. A smell that reminded her of her mother's garden before the war, before the POWs, before everything burned. She nearly wept. "They give this to prisoners," Akani whispered. Her voice was flat with disbelief. Another woman, older and harder, muttered her response. "It must be to mock us, to show us how clean they are, how much they have while we have nothing." Hannah touched the soap on her own bed, then pulled her hand back as if it had burned her. "Or it's poisoned. Don't use it. Don't touch anything they give us." The women unpacked what little they had, set their few possessions on the small shelves beside their beds, sat on the mattresses tentatively testing whether they were real. Some lay down immediately exhausted beyond measure. Others stood at the windows looking out at the camp, at America, at the impossible reality they now inhabited. That night, after the lights were dimmed and the guards had left them alone, Emiko could not sleep. She lay in the bed, which was softer than anything she had slept on in years, and stared at the ceiling. The mattress felt like clouds, the pillow like a luxury beyond deserving. She listened to the other women breathing in the darkness. Some cried quietly, others whispered prayers. Kazuko's voice drifted from the far end of the room, stern and certain. "This is a test. They want to make us soft, want us to forget who we are. We must remain strong. We must remember our duty." But Emiko's hands found the soap beside her bed. She lifted it in the darkness, felt its weight, its smoothness. The small flowers pressed into its surface, and when she could stand it no longer, she rose and walked to the washroom at the end of the dormitory. The washroom was clean, white tiles, sinks with running water, toilets that flushed, mirrors that reflected back her hollow face. She turned on a faucet. The water ran clean and cold. She wet her hands, rubbed the soap between her palms. The lather bloomed white and rich, more luxurious than anything she remembered. It covered her hands in soft foam that caught the dim light from the window. She stared as if watching a miracle, as if witnessing something impossible. The soap did not sting, did not smell harsh or chemical. It just smelled clean, pure, like spring after a long winter, like forgiveness after long guilt, like mercy after long war. She washed her hands 3 times, 4 times, 5. until the water ran clear and her skin felt new. Then she dried them on the towel and walked back to her bed in the darkness. She pulled out her diary, wrote by moonlight that streamed through the window. The soap does not sting. It smells like spring. I think of my mother washing rice in our kitchen. I cannot hate them for giving me this, and that terrifies me more than cruelty ever could. Morning came with a bell, not harsh or militaristic, just a gentle ringing that said it was time to wake. The women rose slowly, uncertain of what the day would bring. They dressed in their worn uniforms, washed their faces. Some used the soap. Others refused, following Kazuko's lead, determined to maintain what they called honor. They were called to formation outside. An American sergeant stood with a clipboard calling names. He pronounced them carefully, respectfully, trying to get each syllable right, even though he clearly did not speak Japanese. When he mispronounced a name, he apologized and tried again. This small courtesy felt like a knife in Emiko's chest. The enemy was being kind, patient, respectful. Everything they had been taught said this was impossible. Yet here it was happening, real as the soap, real as the sun on her face. Then they were marched to the mess hall. The building was larger than the dormitory, long tables with benches, windows that let in morning light. And the smell, God, the smell, it hit them before they even entered. Coffee, toast, butter, bacon, the rich, overwhelming aroma of food, real food. More food than they had smelled in months. Several women stopped in their tracks, unable to move forward, unable to process what their noses told them was waiting. They filed through a serving line. An American cook stood behind the counter. He was a large black man with kind eyes and powerful forearms dusted with flour. He smiled as he spooned food onto metal trays. Scrambled eggs, yellow and steaming. Strips of bacon crisp and glistening with fat. Toast with butter already melting into the bread. A cup of coffee dark and fragrant. An orange bright and impossible. Emiko took her tray with hands that shook. This was more food than she had seen on a single plate in 6 months. More food than most Japanese civilians saw in a week. And this was just breakfast. Just a normal morning meal in an American prison camp. The sergeant who had taken roll gestured to the tables. His voice was gentle. Eat. It's for you. Hana sat beside Emiko. For several minutes, neither of them moved. They just stared at their trays. The food was real. The steam rising from the eggs was real. The smell of coffee was real. But it felt like a dream, like something that could not possibly exist in the world they knew. Around them, other women did the same. Frozen, unable to cross the divide between expectation and reality, between what they had been promised and what sat before them. One woman at the far table stood abruptly. Her chair scraped against the floor. This is a trick. They want to soften us. Tomorrow they will show their true face. She refused to eat, pushed her tray away. Several others joined her in protest, their faces set with determination. Better to starve with honor than to accept enemy charity. But most were too hungry, too tired, too overwhelmed by the smell and the abundance and the simple, terrible kindnesses of hot food on a cold tray. Hana lifted a slice of toast. Her hand trembled as she brought it to her mouth. She bit down. The bread was soft, rich, buttery, unbelievable. Tears spilled silently down her cheeks as she chewed. Emiko picked up a strip of bacon. The grease was still warm on her fingers. She bit down and the taste exploded across her tongue. Salt and fat and smoke. Richness beyond anything she remembered. A taste like summer, like peace, like everything war had stolen. And she began to cry too. Not from sadness, not from fear. From the cognitive dissonance of eating like this while knowing what their families endured. From shame at enjoying enemy food. From confusion at every single thing their lives had become. The eggs tasted like childhood. The coffee tasted like civilization. The orange tasted like something that should not exist in wartime. Each bite was a small betrayal. Each swallow a tiny surrender. But they ate because they were human. Because hunger was stronger than ideology. Because the body does not care about propaganda when it has been starving. That afternoon, work assignments were posted. Emiko was assigned to help in the administration building. Light clerical work, filing and sorting. Hana was sent to the camp hospital to assist with medical supplies. Kazuko was assigned to the laundry. Others went to the kitchen, the library, various maintenance tasks. The work was not hard, not punishing, just ordinary tasks that needed doing. And the Americans supervised without cruelty. They explained what needed to be done. They corrected mistakes patiently. They said please and thank you. It was maddening. On the third day, Amiko fell ill. A fever came on suddenly in the afternoon, making her shiver despite the Texas heat. She left her work detail and returned to the dormitory, her body aching and her mind foggy with sickness. She lay in her bed, sweating through her uniform, too weak to even write in her diary. An hour later, footsteps approached. She opened her eyes to see Sergeant Morrison standing a respectful distance from her bed. He was 29 years old with sun-weathered skin and sad eyes that had seen too much. An Oklahoma farm boy in uniform. He set down a blanket at the foot of her bed, a bottle of medicine, a glass of water. He did not touch her, did not come too close, just placed the items within her reach and spoke quietly. Rest. Doctor will come soon. His voice was kind, not pitying, not condescending, just kind. The way you might speak to a neighbor who had taken ill, the way you might speak to a human being. And that somehow was worse than cruelty would have been. The doctor came an hour later, an older American man with gray hair and gentle hands. He examined her through an interpreter, a Japanese-American woman who translated his questions carefully. When did the fever start? Does your throat hurt? Any nausea, headache? He looked in her ears, listened to her lungs, felt her forehead, was professional and thorough, and never once treated her like an enemy, just like a patient who needed care. He prescribed antibiotics, left instructions for rest and fluids, told her she would feel better in a few days. Then he left, moving on to check on another woman who had developed a cough. That night, Amiko whispered to Hana in the darkness, "If this is the enemy, what were we fighting?" Hana lay on her back, staring at the ceiling, her face troubled in the dim light. "I don't know. I don't know anymore." None of them had answers, just questions that multiplied with each small kindness, each gentle word, each moment that contradicted everything they had been taught. 4 days later, mail arrived. Letters from Japan filtered through the Red Cross. Not all women received letters. Many families were dead or missing or unable to write. But for those who did receive mail, it was the first news from home in months. Imiko's hands shook as she opened the envelope. The letter was from her younger brother, Takeshi. He was 19, had been conscripted near the end of the war. She had not heard from him since April, when he was stationed in Tokyo. "Sister Emiko, if this reaches you, Tokyo is gone. Mother's garden turned to dust. Our house bombed in March raids. She survived living with aunt in countryside. I survived, though I don't know why. We eat what we can find. Roots, grass, sometimes rat. The Americans bomb us daily. Fire bombs turn whole neighborhoods to ash. Children burn alive in streets. Old people die from starvation. And you are their prisoner. Do not shame us by forgetting who the enemy is. Do not let their lies make you soft. Remember what they did to us. They are monsters. Do not forget. Your brother, Takeshi." Emiko read the letter 3 times. Each time, the words cut deeper. Folds it carefully, sets it beside her soap on the shelf. 2 truths existing in impossible proximity. The enemy gave her warmth and food and medicine. The enemy also burned Tokyo, killed civilians, firebombed neighborhoods full of children. Both things were true simultaneously. How to reconcile this? How to hold both truths without breaking? She pulled out her diary, wrote with a hand that trembled. "My brother is starving. My mother's garden is ash. Tokyo burns while I eat bacon and eggs. The Americans who did this are the same Americans who bring me medicine when I am sick. How do I understand this? How can both be true? I feel like I am being torn in half. One half hates them for what they did to Japan. One half is grateful for what they are doing for me. Which half is the traitor?" That evening, the women gathered in the dormitory after dinner. Some shared news from their letters. Many families were dead. Cities destroyed, starvation everywhere. The women who had received good news felt guilty. The women who had received bad news felt angry. Kazuko stood near her bed, her voice rising above the murmur. "You see, this is why we must resist their kindness. They bomb our families while they feed us. They burn our cities while they Give us soap. This is psychological warfare. They want to break our spirits, make us forget, make us traitors. Some women nodded. The letters from home had reminded them of what was real, of who the enemy truly was, of what was at stake. But others looked uncertain. Emiko saw it in their faces, the same confusion she felt. The same impossible attempt to reconcile two contradictory truths. Akon spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. They bombed our cities. We bombed theirs. They killed our people. We killed theirs. Does refusing their kindness now change any of that? Does it bring anyone back? Kazuko turned on her sharply. It preserves our honor. That is what matters. Honor is all we have left. The argument continued but resolved nothing. The women went to bed divided, some clinging to old certainties, others beginning to question everything they had believed. Emiko lay in her bed listening to the distant sound of music from the American barracks. Jazz, soft and strange and foreign. It drifted through the Texas night like something from another world, which she supposed it was. She thought about Takeshi starving in Tokyo, about her mother living with relatives in the countryside, about all the people who had died, about all the reasons they had to hate America. And then she thought about Morrison bringing her medicine, about the doctor who examined her with gentle hands, about the cook who smiled as he served breakfast, about Mrs. Baker, who she had not yet met but whose son had died fighting Japanese soldiers. Two truths, both real, both undeniable, and she did not know how to choose between them, did not even know if choosing was possible. Tomorrow would bring more work, more routine, more small kindnesses that felt like weapons, more evidence that the world was not as simple as anyone had been taught. Tomorrow, Kazuko would continue her campaign, would try to rally the women to refuse American charity, would insist that death was better than this slow erosion of everything they had believed. Tomorrow, Emiko would have to decide where she stood, whether she would cling to ideology or embrace experience, whether honor meant dying for lies or living with truth. But tonight she closed her eyes and smelled lavender on her hands. The soap had not been poison. The food had not been a trick. The medicine had made her fever break. And these small facts felt more dangerous than any bomb. Because if the enemy showed mercy, what did that make them? And if Americans were not monsters, what did that say about the monsters they had been told to become? The questions had no easy answers, but they would define everything that came next, every choice, every transformation, every moment when the old world died and something new struggled to be born. Outside stars revealed overhead, cold and distant and uncaring about human grief. The wind moved through the camp, carrying the scent of Texas prairie and distant rain. Somewhere a guard walked his rounds. Somewhere women in another barracks faced the same impossible choices. And in her bed, Emiko Matsuda drifted towards sleep, clutching her brother's letter in one hand and smelling lavender on the other. Two truths, two worlds, no way to choose between them, no way to hold both without breaking. But she would try, they all would try, because that is what humans do. They survive, they adapt, they find ways to live with impossible contradictions. They break and heal and break again. And somehow, through it all, they remain human. The soap smelled like spring, and spring, Emiko remembered, always came after winter. Even when you thought the cold would last forever. Even when you could not imagine warmth ever returning. Spring came, it always came, without exception. Whether you were ready or not, October slipped into November. The days at Camp Hedges established a rhythm that felt both comforting and dangerous. Wake at 6, formation, breakfast, work, lunch, more work, dinner, evening hours in the dormitory, lights out at 9. The routine was simple, military, predictable, and with each passing day it became harder to remember why they were supposed to hate the people who had created it. On a Tuesday afternoon in late October, the women were taken to a nearby farm for work detail. The farmer needed help harvesting vegetables before the first frost. It was light work, physical but not punishing, the kind of labor that felt almost peaceful under the enormous Texas sky. Emiko worked alongside Hana, pulling carrots from rich, dark soil. The earth smelled clean, alive, nothing like the ash and concrete dust that had covered Tokyo. She found herself thinking about her mother's garden, the small plot behind their house where vegetables had grown in neat rows. Before the bombs, before everything burned, the farmer's wife appeared mid-afternoon walking down the rows with a pitcher and glasses on a tray. She was perhaps 50, with gray hair and a kind face weathered by sun and work. She wore a simple dress and practical shoes, an apron covered in flour dust. The women watched her approach with uncertainty. Was this a test of trick? But the woman just smiled and began pouring lemonade into glasses. The lemonade was cold, golden. Condensation formed on the glass as Emiko took it with trembling hands. She brought it to her lips. The first sip was so bright it made her teeth ache. Sweet and tart and cold and alive. It tasted like summer, like childhood, like days before war when sweet things were possible and ordinary. "Thank you," she whispered in broken English. The farmer's wife smiled, surprised and pleased. "You're welcome, dear. Such simple words, such impossible kindness." Emiko felt tears burning in her eyes and turned away quickly, pretending to focus on her work. That night she wrote in her diary, "Today I laughed. I forgot for a moment that I am the enemy. The lemonade tasted like my mother used to make, like days when the worst thing that could happen was rain during a picnic. I don't know if that makes me weak or human. I am afraid of how much I want to stay in this moment, afraid of how easy it is to forget." The next morning, Sergeant Morrison approached Emiko during a break in her work at the administration building. He held two books, one in English, one with Japanese characters. "You write a lot," he said, gesturing to the small notebook she always carried. "You like words." Emiko nodded, unsure where this was going. Morrison opened the English book, pointed to a word, sun. He pointed to the sky, then pointed to the Japanese book to a character he had clearly marked beforehand, Taiyo. His pronunciation was terrible, but he was trying. The enemy was trying to learn her language, to build a bridge across the divide of war and hate and propaganda. Yes, Taiyo. Son, they spent 15 minutes like this, trading words. Sky, Sora, bird, Tori, freedom, Jiu. The last word hung between them. Freedom. Such a complicated word. Such different meanings. Morrison thought it meant the America he knew. The farms and open roads and the right to say what you believed. Emiko thought it meant something she had lost. Something she might never find again. Private Webb appeared young and enthusiastic. He was 19, had never seen combat, still had the innocent face of a boy who thought war was adventure. "This is neat. Can you teach me too?" And so the lessons became routine. A few minutes each day, building vocabulary, learning to communicate across the vast divide that separated them. Small bridges made of words, fragile but real. From across the compound, Kazuko watched. Her face was hard, her eyes cold. She saw these lessons not as connection, but as betrayal. And she stored each moment like evidence for a trial that was coming. The evenings in the dormitory became battlegrounds. Kazuko had positioned herself as the keeper of tradition, the voice of what she called honor. She would stand near her bed after dinner, speaking to any woman who would listen. "We are losing ourselves. Look at you, learning their language, laughing at their jokes, eating their food without shame. You forget who the enemy is. You forget what they did to our families." Some women nodded. The letters from home had been harsh reminders. Cities destroyed, families starving. The contrast between their comfort and Japan's suffering was impossible to ignore. "My brother died for the emperor," Kazuko continued. "He flew his plane into an American ship knowing he would die. That is honor. That is sacrifice. What are we doing? Sitting in comfortable beds, eating eggs and bacon, learning English. This is exactly what they want. To make us soft, to make us forget." But Akane spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. "Your brother is dead. My fiancé is dead. Hana's whole unit is dead. Does refusing comfort bring them back? Does suffering now honor their sacrifice, or does it just create more suffering?" Kazuko's face flushed with anger. "You sound like them, like the Americans. Soft, weak. You have forgotten what it means to be Japanese." The argument continued, but resolved nothing. The women went to bed divided, and the division grew deeper with each passing day. Emiko was called to Mrs. Baker's office on a Thursday morning. She walked nervously down the hallway, wondering if she had done something wrong. But when she entered, Mrs. Baker simply gestured to a chair and asked her to help sort files. They worked together in silence for a while. Mrs. Baker organized documents while Emiko filed them alphabetically. The work was simple, meditative, the kind of task that let the mind wander. After an hour, Mrs. Baker spoke. "You were a teacher. Before the war." It was not a question. She had read Emiko's file, knew her background, but she was starting a conversation. Offering something? Yes, literature, poetry, to young girls. Mrs. Baker nodded. She was quiet for a moment, then reached across her desk and picked up the photograph of her son. Michael wanted to be a teacher too. He studied Japanese culture in college. Loved it. The poetry, the art, the gardens. He wrote me letters about it. She paused. Her fingers traced the edge of the frame. He died at Saipan, fighting your people. The words hung in the air, heavy, undeniable. Emiko felt her throat constrict. "I am sorry." Mrs. Baker looked at her directly. Her eyes were dry, but held depths of grief that needed no translation. "I know, and I'm sorry too, for all of us." Then she said something that changed everything. "He didn't die because of you. He died because of war. War kills everyone it touches. If I hate you, does that bring him back? No. Hate only makes more death. Maybe kindness honors him better." Emiko stared at this woman who had every right to cruelty but chose mercy. This woman who lost her son to Japanese soldiers but still treated Japanese prisoners with dignity. This was American courage. Not the courage to fight. The courage to choose mercy when revenge would be easier. That night, Emiko wrote for an hour. Pages and pages trying to understand. Trying to reconcile Mrs. Baker's kindness with Takeshi's anger. Trying to hold both truths without breaking. Saturday evening brought music. The American guards had a gramophone and records. They set it up outside their barracks and the sound drifted across the compound. Jazz, Glenn Miller, Duke Ellington. Swing music with rhythms that were foreign and hypnotic. Some of the younger women drifted toward the fence that separated the compounds. Not close, just near enough to hear better. The music was unlike anything they knew. Wild and free and joyful in ways Japanese music never was. Webb was on duty near the fence. He saw them listening and smiled. "You like it?" The women nodded shyly. He did a few dance steps. Basic swing, exaggerated and silly. The women giggled despite themselves. Laughter felt strange, foreign, almost forbidden. But it also felt good. Kazuko appeared from the dormitory, her face twisted with fury. She strode across the yard and grabbed the arm of one of the younger women. "What are you doing? Dancing with the enemy. Have you no shame, no honor?" The music stopped. The moment shattered. The women scattered back to the dormitory like frightened birds. That night, Kazuko's voice was harsh in the darkness. "This is how it happens. Slowly. One song, one smile, one kind word. Until you forget who you are. Until you become them. Until you are no longer Japanese." But Emiko could not sleep. She lay staring at the ceiling, thinking about music and laughter and the terrible power of joy. How it could make you forget. How it could heal wounds you did not know you had. How it was both gift and weapon. The next morning, Kazuko did not appear at breakfast. Emiko found her in the dormitory sitting on her bed. Her breakfast tray sat untouched on the floor beside her. "I will not eat their food anymore," Kazuko announced to the women who had returned to check on her. "This is how I maintain dignity. This is my protest." By noon, 8 other women had joined her, refused lunch, sat in the dormitory while others went to work. By dinner, the number had grown to 12. Morrison reported it to Mrs. Baker. She called Kazuko to her office. Through the interpreter, Mrs. Baker spoke carefully. "You're free to refuse food. That's your choice. But you're responsible for the others you influence. If they become ill, their blood is on your hands." Kazuko's response was immediate. Better dead with honor than alive with shame. Mrs. Baker leaned back in her chair. Her face was tired. "I've heard that before. It's how wars start." The hunger strike lasted 3 days. On the 3rd day, one of the younger women fainted during roll call. The camp doctor examined her and prescribed immediate nutrition. She was given no choice. She ate. The strike crumbled. After that, one by one, the women returned to meals. Even Kazuko, though she would never admit it was hunger that defeated her ideology, she claimed the strike had accomplished its purpose, made its point, but everyone knew the truth. Even belief could not sustain you when the body demanded food. That evening, another confrontation erupted. Kazuko had been watching Emiko throughout dinner, watching her eat without apparent guilt, watching her thank the cook in English, watching her smile at something Morrison said as he passed their table. In the dormitory after lights out, Kazuko's voice cut through the darkness. You have become one of them, Emiko. Look at you. You use their soap, speak their language, laugh at their jokes. You have forgotten Tokyo burns, forgotten your brother starves. You are no longer Japanese. For a moment's silence. Then Emiko sat up in her bed. No, I haven't forgotten. I carry Tokyo with me every moment. But I also see truth. These people show us mercy when they have the right to revenge. Mrs. Baker lost her son. Morrison lost his brother. They still treat us like human beings. She paused, gathering courage. Maybe real honor isn't dying. Maybe it's choosing to see the truth even when it's painful. Maybe the real betrayal is clinging to hate just because it's easier than admitting we were lied to. The dormitory erupted, women arguing, some supporting Kazuko, others supporting Emiko, voices rising in anger and fear and confusion. The division that had been growing finally broke open. When Morrison appeared at the door concerned by the noise, the women fell silent. But the damage was done. The camp was split. About 20 women sided with Kazuko, maintaining their rigid adherence to the old code. About 27 sided with Emiko, choosing to accept reality, even when it contradicted everything they had been taught. The next morning, Mrs. Baker called a meeting. All prisoners required to attend. Through the interpreter, she spoke clearly. You're divided, that's your right. You can believe what you want, but you will not harm each other. You will not enforce your beliefs on others. In America, we believe in individual choice, even for prisoners. Eat or don't eat, that's your choice. But don't stop others from choosing differently. It was not peace, but it was a framework, a way to coexist despite fundamental disagreement. November brought cold, real cold. The Texas winter was mild by northern standards, but brutal to women accustomed to Japanese climates. Frost dusted the ground each morning. The wind cut through thin uniforms like knives. The Americans distributed coats, thick wool coats with buttons and hoods, warm socks, gloves. Even Kazuko's faction, after one night of shivering, accepted them. Pride had limits when your fingers turned blue. Emiko wrapped herself in the coat and felt tears sting her eyes. It was warm, so warm. And it smelled like wool and mothballs and something indefinably American. She thought about her mother and brother facing winter in Japan without proper clothing, without heat, without enough food to keep their bodies warm. The guilt was crushing. On a gray afternoon in mid-November, the camp commander gathered all prisoners in the mess hall. His face was serious. The interpreter looked troubled. The war is officially over. Japan has surrendered unconditionally. You'll be repatriated to Japan in the coming months. We're arranging transport as quickly as possible. The reaction was immediate. Some women cheered, going home. Finally, others cried, what home, what was left? Kazuko stood frozen, her face pale. See, she said later, her voice hollow. We lost, because people like you surrendered the spirit. But Emiko shook her head. We lost because we were fighting a war we couldn't win, because we were lied to from the beginning, because our leaders valued honor more than lives. That night, Emiko could not sleep. She rose and walked outside wrapped in her American coat. The stars were cold and distant. The wind smelled like winter. Morrison stood near the gate smoking. He saw her and nodded. You'll be going home soon. Home, she repeated. The word felt strange. What is home now? You'll see your family again, if they're alive. Long silence, just the sound of wind and Morrison's cigarette burning. I killed Japanese soldiers, he said suddenly. At Iwo Jima, I was 17. I thought I'd feel good about it. Revenge for my brother who died at Saipan. But I just felt empty. His voice was raw. Confession or apology, maybe both. We did terrible things too, Emiko said quietly. Our army in China, in the islands. I used to believe we were righteous. Morrison looked at her. Every side believes that. Emiko looked up at the stars, enormous, unbothered by human grief. This place, it's not what they told us. It's heaven compared to what we made on Earth. Morrison was quiet for a moment. Maybe that's the point, to show you we're all just people. Maybe that's how we prevent the next war. 3 days later, Kazuko received a letter, the first she had gotten since arriving. She opened it with shaking hands. Read it, standing by her bed. Her face went pale. Then she walked outside without a word. Akane found her behind the dormitory an hour later, crying. The first time anyone had seen Kazuko cry, her body shook with spasm she could no longer contain. What happened? Kazuko handed her the letter. It was from her sister-in-law, her brother's widow, the brother who had been a kamikaze pilot, the brother whose heroic death Kazuko had held up as the ultimate example of honor. The letter was brief, brutal in its honesty. Your brother did not die gloriously. His plane malfunctioned, crashed into the ocean. He drowned slowly, terrified. His last message before he died said he didn't want to die, that he was sorry, that he wished he could come home. There was no honor, only fear, only a boy who wanted to live. Everything Kazuko had believed about her brother's death was a lie. The heroic sacrifice, the glorious end, the perfect example of Bushido. All lies. Emiko found her later in the small chapel, an unused building where prisoners sometimes went for quiet. Kazuko sat on a bench staring at nothing. Emiko sat beside her, said nothing at first, just sat. Two women who had been enemies, who had fought over ideology and honor and the meaning of survival. I'm sorry about your brother. Kazuko's voice was barely a whisper. He died a coward, afraid. He died human. That's not cowardice. Kazuko turned to look at her. Her eyes were red. Her face was stripped of all its certainty. I've been so angry. At you, at everyone. Because if you're right, if kindness exists, if the Americans aren't monsters, then what was all the death for? What did my husband die for? My brother Emiko had no easy answer. Maybe so we could learn, so we could choose differently next time. Outside snow began to fall. The first snow of winter. It drifted down like ash, like cherry blossoms, like all the beautiful, terrible things that fall from the sky and change everything. Kazuko and Emiko sat together in the quiet chapel. Not friends, not yet, but no longer enemies. Just two women trying to understand how the world had turned upside down, how kindness had become a weapon, how truth had become more dangerous than any lie. Tomorrow would bring December, would bring Christmas preparations, would bring the final revelations that would transform them completely, would bring the journey toward going home, toward carrying these truths back to Japan, toward becoming witnesses to something too vast and human and painful to ever forget. But tonight they sat in silence while snow fell outside. Two women who had lost everything, learning that sometimes survival is not about holding on to the past. Sometimes it's about letting go. Sometimes the hardest thing is not dying for what you believe. It's living long enough to discover you believe the wrong things. The chapel was cold, but they sat together anyway, finding something in shared brokenness, finding something in the wreckage of ideology, finding something that might eventually become understanding. Outside, America slept, peaceful and prosperous and untouched by the war that had consumed the rest of the world. Inside, Japanese women tried to make sense of mercy, tried to understand how the enemy had become something else, tried to hold impossible truths without breaking. The snow fell, silent and relentless, covering everything in white, hiding the divisions between compounds, between people, between past and future. For a moment, the world looked clean, new, as if anything were possible, as if even the deepest wounds could heal. And perhaps Emiko thought, watching snow accumulate on the chapel window, perhaps that was the point. Perhaps that was what America wanted them to see, that healing was possible, that mercy was real, that even after the worst war in human history, humanity could survive. The snow fell, and in its falling, something shifted, something changed, something began that would carry them through the final weeks at Camp Hedges, through Christmas and goodbye and the long journey home, through all the impossible days that lay ahead. The hardest thing Emiko realized wasn't surviving war. It was surviving the peace that followed. It was carrying truth back to people who weren't ready to hear it. It was choosing mercy when everyone expected vengeance. It was being human when the world demanded you be a soldier. But they would try. They would all try. Because that's what humans do. They break and heal and break again. And somehow, impossibly, they endure. December arrived with frost and fog. The mornings were cold enough to see your breath. The evenings required extra blankets. But inside Camp Hedges, something was changing. Not in the buildings or the routines, in the women themselves. The announcement came during breakfast on the first Monday of December. Transport ships were being arranged, likely departure in February. Medical exams would begin next week. Each woman would receive a care package for the journey. Food blankets, basic supplies. The mess hall filled with mixed sounds. Some women cheered, finally going home. Others felt silent fear etched in their faces. What home? What was left, Emiko felt both emotions warring in her chest. She wanted to see her mother, her brother. But she also felt something unexpected. Sadness at leaving. How could she miss a place she was supposed to hate? That afternoon, Mrs. Baker posted a notice on the dormitory door. An invitation, not an order. Christmas celebration, December 24th. All prisoners welcome to attend. Optional, of course, but you are invited. The women gathered around the notice, reading it through uncertain eyes. Christmas, the enemy's holiday. Some wanted nothing to do with it. Kazuko among them, though her voice lacked its former certainty. Others were curious. What did an American Christmas look like? And some, like Emiko, saw it as a final chance to understand these people who had shown them such impossible kindness. On December 20th, Emiko was called to Mrs. Baker's office. She entered nervously, wondering if something was wrong. But Mrs. Baker simply smiled and gestured to a chair. I wanted to give you this before Christmas, before things get busy. She pushed a small package across the desk. It was wrapped in brown paper tied with string. Emiko picked it up carefully as if it might break. Open it. Inside was a dictionary, English to Japanese, Japanese to English. The cover was worn leather. The pages showed use. This was not new. This was personal. Emiko looked up, confused. It was Michael's. From college. He used it when he studied your language, your culture. He loved words. Like you. Mrs. Baker's voice was steady, but her eyes were bright. Now it's yours. Use it well. Build bridges with it. That's what he would have wanted. Emiko opened the front cover. Inside, in careful handwriting, was an inscription. Words build bridges. Use them well. Ruth Baker, December 1945. Below that, older ink faded but still legible. Another inscription from years before. To Michael, may language open doors to understanding. Love, Mom. September 1940. Emiko could not speak, could not form words around the thickness in her throat. Mrs. Baker had given her son's dictionary, a piece of him, a bridge across death and war and hate. I cannot take this. It's too precious. Mrs. Baker's voice was firm but kind. That's exactly why you must take it. Precious things should be shared. Go home. Tell your people what you saw here. Tell them that Americans aren't monsters, just people, capable of both destruction and mercy. Maybe if both sides remember that we'll never do this again. That night, Emiko held the dictionary like a sacred object. She opened it to random pages, seeing Michael's notes in the margins. Japanese characters he had been practicing. English words he had circled. A young man trying to understand a culture his country would soon be at war with. She wrote in her diary until her hand cramped. Today, Mrs. Baker gave me her son's dictionary. The son we killed. The son who wanted to understand us. I do not deserve this gift, but I will honor it. I will use it to teach. I will use it to build the bridges he never got to build. This is my promise. To him, to her, to everyone this war destroyed. Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear. The mess hall had been transformed. Evergreen branches hung from the rafters, filling the air with the sharp, clean scent of pine. Red ribbons tied in bows decorated the walls. A Christmas tree stood in the corner, strung with lights that glowed warm against the December darkness. Long tables had been set with white cloths. Candles flickered in glass holders. The American guards had dressed in their best uniforms. The camp commander stood near the tree greeting people as they entered. Most of the women came, even some of Kazuko's faction, drawn by curiosity or loneliness or simple human need for celebration. They filed in quietly, unsure of their place in this foreign ritual. Morrison played guitar in the corner. Webb sang in a clear, pure tenor. Silent night, oh holy night. Songs in a language most of the women did not understand. But the melodies carried meaning beyond words. Peace, hope, something gentle in a world that had been so harsh. The food was extraordinary. Ham glazed with something sweet. Mashed potatoes with butter melting into white peaks. Green beans, fresh bread, and pie. Apple pie with crust that flaked at the touch of a fork. The smells were overwhelming. Cinnamon and cloves and roasted meat and butter. Emiko sat with Hannah and Akane. They ate slowly, savoring each bite, trying to memorize these flavors. Trying to remember that this was real. That the enemy had invited them to celebration. That Christmas in Texas tasted like apples and peace. After dinner, Mrs. Baker stood. The room fell quiet. She spoke through the interpreter. We have small gifts for each of you to take home. To remember us bien, the gifts were distributed. Simple things, practical things, but chosen with care. Emiko received her dictionary already wrapped. Others received English books, writing paper scarves, gloves, small acknowledgments of their humanity. Then Kazuko stood. The room went silent. Every eye turned to her. She had been the voice of resistance, the keeper of the old ways, the one who had insisted they reject every kindness as weakness. She spoke in Japanese. The interpreter translated carefully. I have something to say. She paused, gathering courage. I was wrong about many things. I thought accepting kindness was betrayal, but maybe rejecting kindness is the greater betrayal. My brother didn't want to die. He was afraid. And I'm afraid too. Afraid to admit I was wrong. She looked directly at Emiko. I'm sorry for everything, for making this harder, for clinging to lies because truth was too painful. Her voice broke. You were right. They're just people. And we're just people. And maybe that's all we ever were. Emiko crossed the room, embraced Kazuko while the older woman sobbed. Other women joined, a circle of former enemies. Of women who had fought over ideology and discovered they were all just trying to survive. The Americans watched, not understanding all the words, but understanding the emotion. Some wiped their eyes. Webb cried openly, his young face twisted with feeling he did not fully comprehend. Morrison approached Emiko later near the Christmas tree. The lights reflected in his sad eyes. He pulled a photograph from his wallet. A boy, perhaps 16 in the picture, smiling, freckled, alive. My brother, Danny. He died at Iwo Jima. He was 18. Morrison's voice was rough. Every Japanese soldier I killed, I saw his face. Every one. He handed the photograph to Emiko. Keep this. Remember him. Remember that on both sides, boys died who didn't want to die. Maybe if you remember, you'll teach others. Maybe that's how we honor the dead. Not by hating, but by teaching. Emiko took the photograph with trembling hands. I will remember. I promise. Webb gave Emiko a small American flag patch, the kind soldiers wore on their uniforms. So you remember. Not all enemies stay enemies. The cook gave her a handwritten recipe for apple pie, in English with simple drawings to show the steps, so she could make it in Japan, so she could taste America whenever she wanted. These gifts felt heavier than their physical weight. They were responsibility, legacy, the burden of truth in a world built on lies. January brought medical exams and final preparations. The women were weighed, measured, checked for illness, given clean bills of health, pronounced fit for travel. The date was set. February 15th, they would board trains to the coast, then ships to Japan. 3 weeks left. Emiko spent those weeks learning English with Morrison, teaching Japanese to Webb, helping Mrs. Baker sort files one last time, memorizing the camp, the white barracks, the gravel paths, the flag snapping in the wind, trying to capture it all so she could carry it home. Hana asked her one evening, "Are you ready to go back?" Emiko thought about this, about Tokyo in ruins, about explaining to her mother and brother what she had learned, about teaching in a defeated nation, about carrying truth to people who were not ready to hear it. No, but I'm ready to tell the truth anyway. The night before departure, sleep was impossible. The women packed their few belongings, the clothes they had arrived in, the gifts they had received, letters from home, diaries filled with impossible months. Amico packed Michael's dictionary carefully, Morrison's brother's photograph, the flag patch from Webb, the recipe for apple pie, the soap half used still smelling faintly of lavender. Each object a piece of this strange captivity that had been more revelation than punishment. She walked outside one last time. The February night was cold but clear. Stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. Morrison stood near the gate, smoking as always. Tomorrow you go home, tomorrow. They stood in comfortable silence, two people who had been enemies, who had become something else. Not quite friends, but something deeper. Two witnesses to the same impossible truth. Thank you, she said finally, for everything, for the medicine, for the English lessons, for treating us like humans when you had every right to hate us. Morrison looked at her. We were all just trying to survive. All of us. Morning came too soon. The bugle call one last time. Formation one last time. Breakfast one last time. The eggs and bacon and toast and coffee tasted different now. Not like enemy food, food, just like kindness. The buses arrived at 9. The women lined up with their small bags. The Americans stood nearby, not guarding, just witnessing, saying goodbye. Each woman shook hands with the Americans. Some embraced, protocol forgotten, humanity more important than rules. Mrs. Baker held Amico for a long moment. Go in peace, teach peace. Morrison's handshake was firm, his eyes bright. Remember us. I will. Always. Webb hugged her, this boy who had never learned to hate, who had seen Japanese women and thought of his sisters. I'll never forget you. Kazuko approached Morrison. Through the interpreter, her voice was steady. I hated you, all of you. I wanted you dead. But you showed me mercy when I showed you only contempt. Thank you for teaching me how to be human again. Morrison nodded. His voice was soft. We were all just trying to survive. The buses pulled away. Emiko watched through the window as Camp Hedges grew smaller. The white buildings, the clean paths, the American flag, Morrison and Mrs. Baker and Webb standing together waving. She waved back, tears streaming down her face. Not tears of relief at leaving, tears of grief at going. How strange, how impossible. To mourn leaving captivity, to grieve the end of imprisonment. But that was what kindness did. It changed everything. It made enemies into something else. It made hate impossible. It made truth unavoidable. The train ride to the coast took 2 days. The ship voyage took 3 weeks, longer than the trip from Japan to America. The Pacific was vast and indifferent to human drama. The women spent the voyage processing what had happened, sharing stories, comparing gifts, planning what they would say to people at home, how to explain that the enemy had been kind, that propaganda had been lies, that Americans were just people. Some, like Kazuko, had been transformed completely. Others remained uncertain, but all of them had been changed. All of them carried truths that would burden them the rest of their lives. Approaching Japan, the coast appeared through morning mist, scarred, burned, broken. Nothing like the green American coastline they had seen 6 months before. Tokyo Bay was filled with sunken ships. The shore was lined with ruins. The contrast was devastating. Emiko stood at the rail staring at her homeland. This was what war looked like. This was what defeat meant. Not the clean barracks and hot food of Camp Hedges. This, destruction, ash, rubble. March 1946, Yokohama dock. The women disembarked into chaos, ruined city, desperate people, families searching for lost daughters. The dock was crowded with the living and the ghosts of the dead. Emiko saw her mother, thin, aged, but alive. They embraced and both cried. Her brother Takeshi stood beside their mother, gaunt, silent, his eyes holding things he would never speak. What was it like, her mother asked. Emiko told them everything. The soap, the food, Mrs. Baker and her dead son, Morrison and his dead brother, the dictionary, the Christmas celebration, the kindness that felt like weapons, the truth that contradicted everything. Her mother believed immediately. She had seen American occupation, had experienced their mercy firsthand, but Takeshi struggled. They killed thousands, bombed our cities. And you say they were kind. Both things are true. That's what I learned. Truth isn't simple. Emiko returned to teaching. But she was changed, could not teach the old curriculum, could not repeat the old lies. She taught English using Michael's dictionary, taught American literature, taught culture and context, and the radical idea that enemies were just people you had not understood yet. Her classroom became known. Some parents objected, called her a traitor, an American sympathizer. But students flocked to her, young people hungry for truth, for connection, for understanding of the world beyond Japan's shores. She taught for 30 years, from 1946 to 1976, taught thousands of students. Some became translators, some became diplomats, some became teachers themselves. All of them learned that the enemy was just someone you had not understood yet, that war happened because people forgot the other side was human. That peace happened when people remembered. She married in 1950, a man who had also survived the war, who understood trauma. They had 2 children, 4 grandchildren, built a quiet life from the ruins of everything they had lost. She never forgot Camp Hedges, never forgot Mrs. Baker or Morrison or Webb, never forgot the soap that smelled like spring, or the dictionary that built bridges, or the impossible kindness that shattered hate. 1985. 40 years after the war ended, a letter arrived from Texas, postmarked Dallas, inside a note from Morrison. Dear Emiko, I don't know if you remember me. I was a guard at Camp Hedges. We're having a reunion, several former prisoners, several former guards. Mrs. Baker is still alive, 90 years old but sharp as ever. Would you come? I think it would mean a lot. To all of us. Emiko booked a flight, her first time back to America in 40 years. Her first time on an airplane. The world had changed so much. Japan rebuilt. Prosperous. America still prosperous. The war a memory, though the scars remained. She landed in Dallas on a bright October day, rented a car, drove to what had been Camp Hedges. It was a community center now, the barracks gone, but the land remained, the sky still enormous, the air still smelling faintly of wheat. Inside, a handful of people, old now, gray-haired, but recognizable. Morrison, 68, gray-haired but still with those sad ease. Webb, 59, married with grandchildren. 2 other women from the camp, Hannah among them. They embraced like old friends, like people who had survived something impossible together. Mrs. Baker sat in a wheelchair, 90 years old, frail but alive, her eyes still sharp. She took Emiko's hands. You came. I'm so glad you came. I promised I would use the dictionary. I did. For 40 years. Mrs. Baker smiled. Michael would have been proud. They spent the day sharing stories, laughing at memories, crying at losses. Morrison had become a farmer. Webb a teacher. The women had built lives from wreckage. All of them scarred. All of them healed. All of them carrying the weight of what they had learned. Did you tell people, Morrison asked? About what happened, I did. Some believed, some didn't, but I kept teaching. For 40 years, and I carried your brother's memory, as I promised. Morrison's eyes filled with tears. That means everything. That evening, Emiko stood where the old barracks had been, nothing left but grass and memory. She pulled out the soap, kept all these years, never fully used. It still smelled faintly of flowers, still smelled like spring, like forgiveness, like truth. She thought about the girl she had been, 23 and terrified, certain of hate, certain of enemies, certain the world was simple. She thought about what she had learned, that kindness was more powerful than cruelty, that mercy could wound deeper than violence, that choosing to be human was harder and braver than choosing to be a soldier. 40 years, she had carried these truths home, had taught them to thousands, had built bridges with Michael's dictionary, had honored Morrison's brother and Mrs. Baker's son and all the boys who died believing lies. The sun set over Texas, gold and red and impossible, the same sun that set over Japan, the same stars that would appear in both skies, the same world that humans kept trying to divide and that nature kept insisting was one. For those Japanese women, captivity became revelation. They entered America expecting cruelty and found decency. They returned home not as traitors, but as witnesses to truth too vast, too human, too painful to forget. Some truths come wrapped in kindness. Those are the most dangerous truths of all, because they make you question everything. But they also make you human again. And perhaps that's what the world needed most. Not victory, not defeat, but remembering how to be human. The soap smelled like spring, and spring comes after winter, always, without exception. Even when you think the cold will last forever, spring comes, bringing with it green things, growing things, hope that survives even the coldest night. Emiko stood in the Texas twilight, 60 years old, a lifetime away from the terrified girl who had arrived at Camp Hedges. She had taught, had learned, had built bridges, had honored the dead by teaching the living. She had kept her promises to Mrs. Baker and to Morrison, to Michael and Danny and all the boys who never came home, to Takeshi and her mother and everyone the war had broken. The hardest battles she had learned were not fought with guns. They were fought with words, with understanding, with the courage to see enemies as human, with the strength to choose mercy over revenge. She had fought those battles for 40 years, and she would fight them until her last breath. Because that was what the soap meant, what the dictionary meant, what all of it meant. That even after the worst war in human history, humanity could survive. That even in darkness, light persisted. That even when hate seemed inevitable, love was possible. Kindness had been the cruelest weapon, but it had also been the greatest gift. It had shattered everything she believed. And in that shattering, it had rebuilt her, made her better, made her wiser, made her human in ways war never could. The stars appeared, cold and distant and eternal, watching humans struggle and fail and try again, watching empires rise and fall, watching wars begin and end, always watching, as humanity slowly learned what it meant to be human. Emiko closed her eyes, smelled lavender on her hands. 40 years later, the scent remained. Memory or reality? Perhaps both. Perhaps memory was reality for those who had survived what could not be survived. She thought about all the students she had taught, all the bridges she had built, all the hatred she had prevented by teaching understanding. It was not enough, could never be enough. But it was something, and something was better than nothing. Something was how wars ended, not with surrender documents, not with ceremonies, but with moments of grace, with small choices to be kind when cruelty would be easier, with walls that protected instead of divided. She had learned this at Camp Hedges, in Texas, in the heart of enemy territory, from people who had every right to hate her but chose mercy instead. And she had carried that lesson home, had planted it like a seed, had watered it with teaching, had watched it grow into understanding that spread through generations. The war was over, had been over for 40 years, but its lessons remained, would always remain. As long as people like Emiko remembered, as long as stories were told, as long as truth survived. The soap smelled like spring, and she would carry that scent to her grave. Would carry Morrison's brother and Mrs. Baker's son. Would carry all of them, the living and the dead, the Americans and the Japanese, the enemies who became witnesses to each other's humanity. This was her burden, her gift, her promise kept. And as she stood in the Texas twilight, 60 years old and filled with 40 years of memory, Emiko Matsuda knew she had done what she set out to do. She had told the truth, even when it hurt, even when no one wanted to hear it, even when it cost her everybody's fun. And truth once spoken could never be unspoken. It lived, it grew, it changed the world. One student at a time, one bridge at a time, one moment of understanding at a time. The soap smelled like spring. And spring always and forever came after winter, came with hope, came with green things growing from frozen ground, came with the promise that life persisted, that love endured, that humanity survived. Even after the worst, even after the cruelest, even after everything, always.